The trunk hit the floor of the cabin with a sound like a gunshot, and Helen Hurst stood in the doorway with fire in her eyes and mud on her boots, and absolutely no intention of apologizing for either. "You told me in your letter there was a parlor," she said, her voice carrying the crisp, cutting precision of a woman who had taught school for 6 years in Philadelphia and was not accustomed to being lied to. "You used the word parlor. I have it memorized. A modest cabin with a parlor, a kitchen, and adequate sleeping quarters. Those were your exact words, Mr. Dunlap." Abel Dunlap stood on the other side of what was, generously speaking, a single room, and he had the decency to look somewhat ashamed of himself. He was taller than she had imagined from the letters, broader in the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that formed the canyon walls behind the property. His hat was in his hands. That was something. At least he had the manners to remove his hat. "It has a partition," he said. "I was planning to hang a curtain." "A curtain," Helen repeated. "A good curtain, Mr. Dunlap." She stepped fully inside the cabin, letting the afternoon light from the doorway illuminate the full scope of what she was looking at, which was one room, a cookstove, 2 windows without glass, a table, a single chair, a rope bed, and a man who had clearly never shared a living space with another human being in a very long time. "I have traveled by train for 4 days and by wagon for 2 more. I have not slept in anything approaching comfort since Missouri. I have been stared at by no fewer than 17 separate strangers in the town of Redrock. I have been informed by the postmaster that women like me do not last out here, and I have arrived to discover that the parlor you promised me is, in fact, a curtain that does not yet exist." "I have the curtain fabric," he said quickly. "It is in the barn." There was a beat of silence so profound that Helen could hear the wind moving across the canyon outside, and something in that wind was ancient and untamed and entirely indifferent to her situation, and she found that she both hated it and felt, for reasons she could not yet name, something dangerously close to being moved by it. She had 12 opinions about this. She had 12 opinions about nearly everything, which was something her mother had considered a flaw, and her father had called a gift, and her former fiancé had called the reason he could not go through with it. She was 27 years old, and she had arrived on the frontier of Colorado Territory in the spring of 1878 with one trunk of belongings, a contract of intended marriage, and a set of convictions so deeply held they practically had their own opinions. But before we arrive properly at what she did next, before we understand why she stayed, why Abel Dunlap sat down heavily in that single chair and put his face in his hands, and why the curtain fabric never made it out of the barn, because something far more essential was unraveling inside those 4 walls, we have to go back to where it began. Helen Hurst had not come to Colorado Territory because she was desperate. That was the first thing people assumed, and it was the thing that most infuriated her. Women who answered advertisements for frontier wives were spoken of in Eastern parlors in hushed, pitying tones, as though the act of making a deliberate and rational choice about one's future was somehow evidence of ruin. Helen had a position. She had students who respected her. She had a mother who set a fine table and sisters who had married appropriate men in appropriate houses in appropriate neighborhoods. She had all of that, and she had chosen this instead. The advertisement had appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer in January of 1878, tucked between a notice for a patent medicine and a lengthy editorial about railroad reform. It had read, in part, "Rancher in Colorado Territory, widower, 32 years of age, owner of productive land and sound cabin, seeks educated, capable woman of good character for companionate marriage. Letters welcomed. Inquire to Abel Dunlap, Redrock, Colorado Territory." The word companionate had caught her attention like a hook, not obedient, not biddable, not of docile temperament, companionate, as though the man actually wanted someone to think alongside him rather than simply beside him. She had written the first letter with the detached curiosity of a woman conducting an experiment. He had written back with a directness that surprised her. His sentences were plain and honest in the way that certain landscapes are plain and honest, not lacking in beauty, but refusing to dress themselves up in ornament. He had told her about his ranch, about the land he had built since coming west from Tennessee 8 years earlier. He had told her about his wife, Clara, who had died of fever 3 years prior, and he had told her this without self-pity, but with a kind of grief that was so carefully contained. It was almost more painful to read than an outpouring would have been. He had not told her about the curtain situation. 12 letters had passed between them over 4 months. By the 4th letter, Helen had formed her 12 opinions about Abel Dunlap, and they were as follows. He was honest, sometimes to a fault. He was proud in the way that solitary people are proud, not from arrogance but from the discipline of self-reliance. He was intelligent but not educated in any formal sense, and he was aware of this and did not pretend otherwise. He was lonely in a way he clearly did not fully recognize in himself. He was stubborn. He was generous with his observations about the land, but reserved about his inner life. He was probably better with horses than with people. He was not a man who laughed easily, but when he made a small, dry remark in the 7th letter about the difficulty of getting a respectable apple tree to grow at altitude, she had laughed for a full minute and suspected that somewhere in Colorado territory, he had smiled at himself just slightly. He was, she concluded, a man who would need to be understood rather than simply known, and understanding was something Helen Hurst had both the patience and the appetite for. She had purchased her train ticket in March. Now she stood in his one-room cabin on the 1st of May, 1878, with the trunk at her feet, and the 12 opinions about Abel Dunlap were still in place, but they were now overlaid with the startling physical reality of him, which was considerably more unsettling than she had prepared for. The letters had given her his mind, but they had not prepared her for the particular quality of his stillness, the way he occupied space without filling it aggressively, the way his eyes, when he looked at her, were the color of creek water over stone, gray-green and quick and unexpectedly watchful. "I want to be honest with you," she said, and he looked up from his examination of the floor. "I'm not going to pretend the cabin is what your letters implied, and I suspect you are not going to pretend that you expected someone quite so forthcoming as I appear to be." "I expected someone somewhat forthcoming," he said carefully. "How forthcoming did you expect?" He considered this. "Maybe half this forthcoming." "Then we are already working with a deficit," she said, "and I think the only sensible thing to do is to acknowledge it and proceed from an honest foundation." He was looking at her with an expression she could not yet read, and she was a woman who prided herself on being able to read expressions. It was somewhere between wariness and something else, something she was not prepared to name at this early stage. "Miss Hurst," he said, "I have to be honest with you about something, please." He turned the hat in his hands. "I have not had a woman in this cabin since Clara died. I have not had much company of any kind. I have been on my own for 3 years on this land, and I know it has made me—" He stopped. "It has made me particular about things, about how things are done. About the way the days run." "Particular," she said. "Particular," he confirmed. Helen looked at the single chair. She looked at the rope bed. She looked at the cook stove, which was actually in reasonably good repair, and the 2 windows without glass, through which the Colorado spring air moved with a cool authority that was so different from Philadelphia's humid softness that it felt like being breathed on by a different planet. She picked up her trunk by its handle and carried it to the far wall, next to the second window. "Then we will each have to make allowances," she said. "I will make allowances for your particularity, and you will make allowances for my opinions, and we will proceed accordingly." "How many opinions are we talking about?" he asked. "At present, 12. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Not quite a laugh. But somewhere in that territory which she was beginning to understand was the emotional equivalent of the frontier itself, vast, sparsely settled, and full of weather. He did not give up the chair. She noticed that. But the next morning she came into the main room to find that he had built a second chair in the night, and it was sitting across the table from the first, and it was a good chair, solid and square, and it fit perfectly under the table as though it had always been meant to be there. She did not mention it, but she sat in it for breakfast, and he sat across from her, and they ate cornbread and coffee in a silence that was not unfriendly, and outside the window the canyon caught the early light and turned it gold, and Helen thought that whatever she had come here for, whatever the 12 opinions and the rational calculation and the advertisement in the newspaper had been about, this morning felt like it might contain something she had not fully anticipated. She had brought books. This was the first thing about which the frontier offered an unexpected opinion. She had 4 books in the trunk, because she had made herself choose carefully, knowing that the weight was a consideration. She had brought a well-worn copy of Mill's On Liberty, which was in her estimation the most important book written in the English language in the past 50 years. She had brought a botanical field guide to North American wildflowers, because she believed in knowing the names of growing things. She had brought a complete collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, which she had loved since girlhood. And she had brought a plain-covered notebook, blank, which was to serve as her journal. Abel had noticed the books when she unpacked them and arranged them on a flat shelf. She created by balancing a plank across 2 nails she drove into the wall herself. He had not commented, but she caught him looking at the spines with a particular attention that suggested something. "Do you read?" she asked, without turning from the wall, "when I can get books?" "What have you read?" A pause. "The Bible, some geology texts, a history of Rome that came in a box of supplies from a general store in Denver. I read that twice." "Which part interested you most?" Another pause, longer this time, as though he was deciding whether the question deserved a real answer. "The Republic," he said finally. "The part before it became an empire. The part where it was still something men had built together and were still deciding what it would be." Helen turned and looked at him then. He was at the cook stove with his back to her, pouring coffee, and he didn't look at her, but something in the set of his shoulders told her he was aware of being considered. "I have a book you would like," she said. "You can borrow it." He did not answer immediately. Then, "All right." The first real test came 4 days after her arrival, and it came in the form of the neighbors. Red Rock, Colorado Territory, had a population of approximately 340 souls in the spring of 1878, spread across the town itself and the surrounding ranches and homesteads. It was not a lawless place exactly, but it was a place where the law had the texture of something recently and not entirely successfully installed, like a fence post that was in the ground but not yet fully set. There was a sheriff, a man named Braddock, who had the eyes of a person who had seen considerable difficulty, and the bearing of someone who had decided that composure was the only viable response to it. There were 2 saloons, a general store, a small church of no particular denomination, a blacksmith, and a woman named Mrs. Cordelia Page, who ran what passed for society in Red Rock with the efficiency of a military campaign and the warmth of a November frost. It was Mrs. Page who came calling on the morning of May the 5th, accompanied by 2 other women whose names Helen did not immediately retain because Mrs. Page was already filling the doorway of the cabin with her presence and her opinion before Helen had finished her first cup of coffee. "So you are the woman from Philadelphia," Mrs. Page said, making Philadelphia sound like a communicable disease. "I am Helen Hurst," Helen said. "Please come in." Mrs. Page came in. She looked at the books on the shelf. She looked at the 2 chairs at the table. She looked at the curtain, which Abel had finally retrieved from the barn, and which Helen had spent an evening hemming and hanging across the rope that now divided the sleeping area from the main room, and which was a perfectly serviceable piece of cotton in a muted blue, and she looked at all of this with the expression of someone conducting an inspection and finding the results inconclusive. "Abel Dunlap has been a widower for 3 years," Mrs. Page said. "His wife Clara was a good woman. A practical woman." "I am certain she was," Helen said. "Would you like coffee?" "She did not bring books," Mrs. Page added. Helen poured coffee with great deliberateness. I imagine different women have different qualities, she said. Mr. Dunlap's advertisement specifically mentioned education as a desirable attribute, so I suspect the books are not entirely unwelcome. Mr. Dunlap needs a wife who can work this land, Mrs. Page said, not a woman who sits reading and forming opinions. Helen set down the coffee pot and turned to face Mrs. Page with the full, collected force of a woman who had been handling difficult people in positions of social authority since she was 19 years old, and had first been told by a school board chairman that her opinions about the curriculum were not required. Mrs. Page, she said pleasantly, I am capable of forming opinions and working the land. I do not believe these activities are mutually exclusive. I have, in fact, already repaired the north fence line, cleaned the cookstove flue, planted a kitchen garden in the square of ground behind the cabin, and formed at least 3 new opinions this morning alone. The day is not yet noon. There was a brief, electric silence. One of the 2 other women made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Mrs. Page looked at Helen with the complex expression of a woman who has encountered an unexpected equal and is deciding whether to be an enemy or an ally. You repaired the north fence line. She said, My father kept horses, Helen said. I know fences. Something shifted in Mrs. Page's expression, not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. Well, she said, and sat down in the chair Abel had built. I suppose we might stay for coffee. Abel had watched this whole exchange from the doorway, having come back from checking the cattle just as the women arrived. He said nothing, but that evening when the women had gone and Helen was at the table writing in her journal, he poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without being asked. You did not have to defend yourself to her, he said, sitting across from her. I was not defending myself, Helen said. I was clarifying my position. What is the difference? Helen looked up from her journal. Defending implies I thought I needed excusing. Clarifying implies I thought she needed educating. He looked at her for a moment with that unreadable expression, and then the corner of his mouth moved just slightly, and it was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite something. Cordelia Page has run this valley for 20 years, he said. Nobody has talked to her like that since her husband died. How did she respond to her husband? Buried him, Abel said, entirely without humor, and then picked up his coffee. Helen stared at him. Then she laughed, and it was a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it filled the cabin in a way that clearly surprised him, because his expression shifted into something open and undefended for just a second before he caught himself. She filed that second away carefully. The work of the ranch was not unfamiliar to her in principle, though unfamiliar in the specific particulars of this land at this altitude. She had grown up going to her uncle's farm in Pennsylvania in the summers, and she had a practical education in gardens and animals and the seasonal logic of land. But the Colorado high country in 1878 was a different creature entirely from a Pennsylvania farm. The altitude meant that what grew well elsewhere required adjustment. The winters, Abel told her, were severe enough to trap a person inside for days at a stretch, and the summers were short and violent and sometimes ended before you were ready. The canyon winds came from directions that defied her sense of geography. The cattle were a breed she did not know, managed in ways she had to learn. She learned them. She asked questions relentlessly, the way she had always asked questions, without apology and without any pretense of already knowing the answers, which was a quality Abel seemed to find alternately useful and startling. He had apparently expected her questions to be about the social or domestic sphere. Instead, she asked him about soil composition and water rights, and why the cattle grazed on the south-facing slopes in the morning, and what the difference was between the grasses and what the signs were in the sky before a particular kind of storm. He answered, slowly at first, and with the careful economy of a man who had spoken primarily to horses and cattle for 3 years. But he answered. They had not yet married. This was a matter of some delicacy. The advertisement and the arrangement between them had been made with the understanding that Helen would come, They would spend a period of acquaintance, and if both parties were in agreement, they would marry. She had insisted on this in her letters, and he had agreed to it, which was another thing about him that had made her take his advertisement seriously. A man who agreed without protest that a woman ought to have time to form her own judgment before making an irrevocable commitment was either genuinely reasonable or very cleverly managing her expectations. She was not yet certain which. The curtain between the sleeping area and the main room served its purpose, and he was a man of his word about the arrangement. But the cabin was small, and the days were long and shared, and the evenings, especially, had a quality of intimacy that Helen had not fully calculated. It was the evenings that began to complicate things. The pattern that developed over the first 2 weeks was this. They worked the daylight hours separately, coming together for the meals she cooked, which he ate with a grateful attention to the food that was itself somewhat endearing for a man who appeared to feel that showing appreciation for anything was a form of strategic vulnerability. In the evenings after the dishes, they sat at the table with coffee and they talked. She had not expected him to be such a good conversationalist. That was perhaps the most startling discovery of the first 2 weeks. Not good in the social sense, not quick or charming or adept at filling silence with pleasant noise, but good in the genuine sense. He thought carefully before he spoke. He was not afraid to say that he didn't know something. He was not interested in being right so much as in understanding correctly, which was a quality she had found rare enough in Philadelphia to be remarkable and found here, in a one-room cabin in Colorado territory, to be the kind of thing that does something to a woman's resistance if she isn't careful. He had started reading Mills on Liberty in the 2nd week. She had lent it to him as promised, and he took it seriously, reading it in the evenings by lamplight, and sometimes stopping to ask her about a passage with the careful directness of a man who takes ideas seriously, which was the most attractive thing Helen Hurst had encountered in a very long time, and she was fully aware of how much trouble that was. He says, Abel said one evening, looking up from the book, that the peculiar evil of silencing an opinion is that it robs the human race. Not just the person whose opinion is silenced. Yes, Helen said. I think I have been silencing myself, he said, and then he seemed surprised that he had said it, and he looked back down at the book. Helen did not say anything. She let the remark settle the way you let something settle that is too important to handle roughly. After a moment he said, I don't know if that made sense. It made complete sense, she said. I think the frontier teaches a kind of silence. There are not many people to speak to, so you stop forming the words. Clara used to say I was the quietest man she had ever met. His voice was neutral when he said her name, the neutral of someone who has made peace with a grief, not suppressed it. She talked enough for both of us. He paused. She was a bright person, the kind of person who made a room feel fuller just by being in it. She sounds lovely, Helen said, and she meant it. She was. He closed the book on his finger to hold his place. You are not the same kind of bright, you are a different kind. Helen was not certain how to take that. Is that a compliment or an observation? Both, he said. She filled silences. You seem to know what to do with them. This felt like something significant, though she could not have articulated precisely why, and she told herself that it was simply a perceptive remark, and did not require her to feel the particular warmth she felt. And then she finished her coffee and went to bed behind the curtain and lay there listening to the canyon wind for a long time. In the 3rd week, something happened that changed the texture of everything. Abel had gone into Redrock for supplies, a trip he made once every 2 weeks that took the better part of a day. Helen had a list for him because she had formed opinions about the state of their provisions, and those opinions included the acquisition of additional salt pork, dried beans, flour, and if the store had it, a ball of good twine. He had taken the list with the expression of a man who was finding the experience of having someone else's requirements to consider both mildly inconvenient and not entirely unwelcome. Helen was in the kitchen garden when he came back, and she knew immediately from the set of his shoulders as he drove the wagon into the yard that something had happened in town. She dusted her hands on her apron and walked to the yard. He climbed down from the wagon seat and stood with his hand on the horse's neck for a moment longer than was necessary. "What is it?" she said. He turned to look at her. "There was a man in town asking questions," he said. "At the general store. Asking about a woman named Helen Hurst from Philadelphia." The blood left her face. She felt it go. She had known, in the abstract way that one knows things one has not fully confronted, that this moment might come. She had not known it would come so soon. "What kind of questions?" she said, and her voice was steady, which she was proud of, even as her heart was doing something complicated and frightened in her chest. Questions about whether she had arrived, whether she was living at the Dunlap property. Abel was watching her with those creek-water eyes, and she could see him reading her, reading the change in her color, reading the particular quality of her stillness, which was no longer the stillness of composure but the stillness of something braced. Who was this man, Helen? She had not told him. She had not lied exactly, but she had not told him, and there was a version of that which felt, standing here in the yard in the May sunshine with the canyon walls rising behind them, dangerously close to a betrayal. "His name is probably Warren Fitch," she said. "He was my fiancé, former fiancé. We ended the engagement in November before I answered your advertisement." Abel said nothing. The horse moved its head gently against his hand. "He ended it," Helen said, because she believed in precision. "But when I left Philadelphia, he apparently changed his mind. He wrote to my mother, who told him I had gone west. My mother did not consider this information private." She paused. "Warren Fitch is a man who does not accept that choices can be made without his consent. He considers my decision to come here to be a form of rebellion that requires correction." "He considers it that," Abel said. "Yes. And what do you consider it?" She looked at him directly. "I consider it my life, which I am conducting as I see fit." A long moment passed. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the canyon, 3 clear notes, and then silence. "Was there more?" Abel asked. "That you didn't tell me?" This was the real question, and she recognized it. Not just about Warren Fitch, about everything. About the hidden motive she might have had for coming. About whether the choice to answer the advertisement was entirely what she had represented it to be. "My reputation was damaged," she said quietly. "When Warren ended the engagement, he told people a story about why. It was not an honest story. In Philadelphia, it became difficult to continue as I had been. The school board met to discuss my position. My mother was distressed. My sisters were sympathetic, but not in ways that were useful. So yes, there was an element of not running away, I will not call it that, but of choosing to leave a place that had become hostile to me rather than staying to fight a fight on unfavorable ground." She stopped. The meadowlark called again. "I still came because of the advertisement," she said. "Because of what you wrote, because of who you seemed to be in the letters. That is also true. Both things are true at once." Abel had not moved during any of this. He stood with his hand on the horse's neck and looked at her with an expression she was only now beginning to learn to read, and what she read in it now was not judgment. It was something more careful than that, something that was trying to be fair. "All right," he said. "All right." "Both things can be true," he said. "That is not a secret that changes anything." She felt something in her chest loosen, something she had not known she was holding tightly. "If this man comes here," Abel said, and his voice changed, dropped into a register she hadn't heard from him yet, quiet and absolutely certain, "he will find that you have made your choices and I will support them." He took the supplies from the wagon and went inside, and Helen stood in the yard for a moment longer, her hands folded in front of her, and she was aware that something had shifted between them, something that could not be shifted back, and she was not at all certain she wanted it to be. Warren Fitch arrived in Redrock 9 days later. Helen knew about it before Abel did, because Mrs. Page, who had achieved something approaching respect for Helen in the weeks since the coffee incident, and who had a network of information that would have impressed a military intelligence operation, sent her 13-year-old son out to the Dunlap property with a message. The message said, "There is a well-dressed man from the east at the hotel asking very pointed questions about you. He has money and the manner of a man who expects money to solve his problems. Be advised." Helen read the note at the kitchen table and then folded it very precisely and set it in front of her and looked at it. Abel came in from the north pasture for lunch and found her sitting that way, and he sat down across from her and waited, because he had learned in these weeks that she came to things at her own pace and pushing only delayed the arrival. She told him about the note. He read it. His jaw tightened slightly. "What does he want?" "He wants me to come home," she said. "He will characterize it as rescue. He will describe this arrangement as something I was tricked into or driven to by desperation, because that is easier for him than accepting that I made a deliberate choice he does not approve of." "And what do you want to do?" She had been thinking about this since she read the note. She had been thinking about it with the full 12-opinion process, the way she thought through anything that mattered. And what she arrived at, sitting in that cabin at that table with the canyon light coming through the glass-free windows and the smell of the spring land on the air, was something that surprised her with its clarity. "I want to stay," she said. "I am telling you that clearly and without qualification. I want to stay here." Abel looked at her for a moment. "Not because he is coming, because you want to." "Because I want to," she confirmed. "He being on his way is merely a deadline I hadn't anticipated." Something in Abel's face moved, something that was becoming familiar to her now as the thing he did instead of saying things he wasn't ready to say. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment and then looked up at her. "We should get married," he said. "If that is what you want, we could do it this week before he arrives." "I am not going to marry you because Warren Fitch is coming," she said. "If I marry you, it will be because I have decided to marry you, for my own reasons. On my own terms." He almost smiled, almost. "Those are a lot of conditions for a wedding proposal." "You will find," she said, "that I have conditions for most things. It is part of the 12-opinion structure." "How many of the 12 opinions are about marrying me?" She tilted her head. In truth, 6 of the current 12 opinions were about him, and 4 of those 6 were considerably warmer than she had intended them to become in this time frame. And the remaining 2 were about the fact that she was a rational adult woman who made rational adult decisions, and not someone who lost her head over a man who built her a chair in the night and read political philosophy with genuine absorption, and had the kind of stillness that made you feel, inexplicably, like the world was going to be all right. "That," she said, "is proprietary information." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes for a long moment, and then he said quietly, "I would like you to stay, Helen, for my own reasons, on my own terms." It was the first time he had used her first name. In 5 weeks of daily proximity and evening conversation and shared work and shared meals, he had called her Miss Hurst, carefully and consistently. Now he said Helen, and it had the quality of a door being opened. She said, "Then I will." Warren Fitch came to the property on a Thursday morning in late May, arriving in a hired wagon with his clothes in perfect order, and his face set in the expression of a man who has decided that reasonable firmness will accomplish what he has come to accomplish. He was not a bad-looking man. He was 31 years old, with dark hair and the groomed confidence of a Philadelphia lawyer's son, which was what he was. He had a voice trained for persuasion and manners that worked very well in Eastern drawing rooms. He was not in an Eastern drawing room. Helen was in the garden when he arrived, and she stood and watched him come up the track with her gardening gloves on, and a look on her face that she was not attempting to soften. Abel had come around from the barn when he heard the wagon, and he stood slightly behind and to the right of her, not in front of her, not positioned as a guardian or a barrier, but present. Steady. Warren climbed down from the wagon and stopped when he saw her. "Helen," he said, and his voice had a quality of relief and a quality of reproach and a quality of ownership all folded together. "Thank God, I have been looking for you." "I have not been hiding," she said. "I have been here. This is where I am." At Abel, he looked at the cabin. He looked at the garden and the fence and the canyon walls and all of it with the look of a man rapidly revising his assumptions. "This is not what I was told," he said. "Your mother thought you had been that you were in some kind of distress." "My mother worries," Helen said. "I am not in distress. I am in Colorado." Warren looked at Abel again. "And this is Abel Dunlap," Abel said. He didn't offer his hand. "I see." Warren looked back at Helen. "Helen, I need you to hear me. What I said when I ended our arrangement, the things I told people, I was not being fair. I know that. I have come to correct it." "The time for correcting it was before you told those stories," Helen said. "Not after I left." "You left because of me," he said, and there was something in his voice now that was not entirely calculative, something that sounded like actual regret which she noted and did not find sufficient. "I am asking you to come home. I will make it right. The school board will be handled, people will be told the truth, your reputation," "My reputation," Helen said, "is doing very well out here, thank you. I repaired the north fence line on my first week. I have a kitchen garden. I have made friends of a sort. And I have 12 opinions that are entirely intact and not in need of anyone's management." Something crossed Warren's face. She had always had the opinions, and he had always thought, she saw it clearly now, that the opinions were a phase, a particularity of character that affection and proper social pressure would eventually smooth into something more manageable. He had been wrong about that, and looking at him now she could see that he still did not fully understand it. "You can't mean to actually stay here," he said. "Look at this place. Look at it, Helen. You are educated, you are—" "I am home," she said. "This is my home, and I would like you to go, Warren. I mean that kindly, and I mean it finally." Warren looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Abel, and Abel met his gaze with a steadiness that was not aggressive and not backing down and was entirely clear in its meaning, which was that this woman had made her choice and that choice was being honored here. Warren Fitch put his hat back on his head. "I will go," he said. "But I want you to know that if you change your mind—" "I won't," Helen said. "I am not someone who changes my mind after I have fully made it." He looked at her one last time, and she saw in that look something that might have been, beneath the wounded pride and the genuine regret, a kind of recognition. That he had never really known who she was. That he had seen something and called it Helen and built a set of expectations around it that were not built around her at all. He climbed back into the wagon. He drove away down the track. The canyon swallowed the sound of the wagon wheels within minutes, the way the canyon swallowed everything eventually, with a profound and complete indifference. She stood and watched until the wagon was gone. Then she took off her gardening gloves and folded them over her belt. "Thank you," she said to Abel without looking at him, "for standing there." "You didn't need me to stand there," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I am glad you did." She went back to the garden. She could feel him watching her for a moment before he went back to the barn, and the feeling of being watched by him was nothing like the feeling of being watched by the 17 strangers in town on the day she arrived. It was warm. It was careful. It was the feeling of being seen accurately, and she had not known until this moment how long she had been wanting that. The wedding took place on the 14th of June, 1878, on a Saturday morning, in the small church in Raydrock that belonged to no particular denomination, and was presided over by a circuit preacher named Reverend Moss, who came through every 3 weeks, and had the pragmatic spiritual flexibility of a man who has seen the West and adjusted his theology accordingly. Helen had not planned for a significant occasion. She had planned for a real one. She wore the dress she had packed in the bottom of the trunk, the one she had chosen carefully before leaving Philadelphia, the green wool that was too formal for daily wear and too sensible for a grand occasion, and therefore exactly right for a frontier wedding. She had put her hair up in the way she liked best, which was her own way, not the elaborate arrangements fashionable in the East. She had her books on their plank shelf, her journal half full, her garden growing in the square of ground behind the cabin. Abel wore his good shirt, which was a clean, pressed white cotton that fit him well and had clearly been kept for important occasions. He had shaved with evident care. He stood at the front of the church with the stillness she had come to think of as his natural weather, and when she walked in and his eyes met hers, he looked at her with the full, unguarded openness that he usually only allowed himself by accident, and she thought, with a startling rush of certainty, that whatever she had come to Colorado territory for, it had been this. It had been exactly this. The Reverend Moss asked the necessary questions. Helen said I will instead of I do, because she was constitutionally unable to say something she hadn't chosen, and Reverend Moss accepted this with the flexibility of his position. Abel said I do, very quietly looking at her. Mrs. Page was there, in her good hat, and whatever her private reservations, she had brought a jar of her celebrated peach preserves as a wedding gift, which was by local standards a gesture of substantial warmth. The two other women from the initial coffee visit were there. The sheriff, Braddock, was there, because he knew Abel and had a regard for him that expressed itself in showing up. Several neighboring ranchers and their wives filled the remaining pews. After the ceremony in the yard of the church, with the June sun making the canyon walls look like burning copper, Mrs. Page came to Helen and said, stiffly but with sincerity, "You will do well here. You have the right kind of stubbornness for this land." "Thank you," Helen said. "That is possibly the finest compliment I have received." Mrs. Page looked at Abel, who was talking with Sheriff Braddock across the yard, and then back at Helen. "He is a good man," she said. "He has been very alone. It is not good for a person to be that alone." "No," Helen agreed. "It is not." She looked at Abel across the yard, at the way he stood, at the way the June light fell across him, and felt the particular warm weight of knowing that she was going to spend her life in proximity to this person, this specific, careful, quiet, thoughtful, stubborn person, and that it was the right decision. She had 12 opinions, and they were all in agreement. The summer of 1878 settled over the canyon like something golden and purposeful. The work of the ranch filled the days with a useful exhaustion that Helen found she did not resent the way she had been warned she might. The garden grew well, better than expected, and she found in the tending of it a satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of teaching but related to it, the satisfaction of something growing under your care in the direction you had hoped. Abel was teaching her to ride properly, the Western way, which was different from the Eastern style she had learned as a girl. He was a good teacher when he wasn't trying to be, which was the only way he knew how. He explained things carefully, without condescension, corrected without unkindness, and never once suggested that difficulty meant inability. She was teaching him things too. She taught him the botanical names of every plant in the canyon that was cataloged in her field guide, which he took to with the same seriousness he brought to everything intellectual. She taught him a different way to keep accounts, a method more efficient than what he had been doing, which saved him considerable time each month. She read to him some evenings from Shakespeare's sonnets, and he listened with the quiet attention he gave to everything he considered worth his time, which was its own kind of honor. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" she read one evening in late July, the lamp burning golden between them, the canyon dark outside, the Colorado sky salted thick with stars that Philadelphia had never shown her. "Thou art more lovely and more temperate." She looked up from the page and found him looking at her. Not at the book, at her. She kept her eyes on him and finished the sonnet from memory, because she had known it since she was 15, and the words felt different coming out of the lamplight with him looking at her that way, as though they had been written for this room and this night and this particular quality of attention. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then, "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me." "I have been thinking that I was afraid," he said, with the careful difficulty of a man navigating unfamiliar country. "When I put the advertisement in the paper, I told myself I needed a practical arrangement, someone to help with the ranch. I talked myself into keeping it reasonable, so that if it didn't work out, I hadn't risked anything I couldn't afford to lose. And now," she said softly, "and now I think I was wrong about what I could afford to lose," he said, "and what I am risking and what I would like it to be." Helen closed the book of sonnets. Abel, she said, in the same voice she had used for I will at the front of the church. Chosen, certain, entirely her own. He came around the table to her, and he was not a man who moved quickly toward anything emotional, but he moved now, and when he took her face in his hands that were rough from the land and careful from everything else, it was with a tenderness so complete that she felt it in the center of her chest like a struck note. He kissed her with all the quietness and all the depth of a man who had been containing something for a very long time, and she kissed him back with everything she had brought in the trunk, and everything she had formed into opinions, and everything she had not expected to find when she answered the advertisement, which was, it turned out, very nearly everything that mattered. Outside, the canyon held its patient stars. The wind moved through the grasses in the dark. The garden grew quiet in the summer night. Inside the cabin, the curtain on the rope served its last purpose, because after that evening there were some walls that didn't need to stand any longer. By August, the 12 opinions had been supplemented by several new ones. Helen's original opinions about Abel Dunlap had evolved with the information of living alongside him, the way a map becomes more detailed as territory is actually traversed. She had been right about most things and wrong about a few, and both the rightness and the wrongness were interesting. She had been right that he was stubborn. She had underestimated the degree to which he was also funny, in the quiet, dry way that crept up on you and left you laughing before you understood why. She had been right that he was better with horses than people. She had not anticipated that he would become, with her specifically, easier with people than she had ever imagined him capable of being, which suggested that the difficulty was not with people in general, but with the absence of the right one. He had begun to talk more. Not a great deal more, because that was not his nature, but enough that the evenings had expanded into longer conversations. Conversations that moved from the practical to the philosophical to the personal in the easy drift of two people who are learning each other's minds the way you learn a landscape, by moving through it at different paces in different lights. He told her about Tennessee, about his family, about the younger brother who had died in the war. He told her about coming west with $20 and a horse and a stubborn belief that the land was out there and only required the will to find it. He told her about Clara more fully, with the particular love and loss that you can only speak about clearly when you have something new to hold you upright. Helen listened to all of it with the quality of attention she gave to things she wanted to understand deeply, and she told him about her own life in return, the school years, the students she had loved, the books that had shaped her, the slow accumulating conviction that Philadelphia was too small for who she was, which had nothing to do with Philadelphia's actual size and everything to do with what it had wanted her to be. "I frightened Warren," she said one evening without bitterness. "Not deliberately. But I think I frightened most of the men I knew. The ones who were interested would become less interested when they understood what they were actually dealing with." "What were they dealing with?" Abel said. "A person," she said, "a full and inconvenient person." "I knew what I was dealing with," he said, "by the fourth letter." She tilted her head. "And you were not frightened." He considered this with his characteristic honesty. "I was terrified," he said. "I sent the letter back anyway." She loved him for that. She was aware, in the moment, of loving him for that specifically, and she filed it alongside the chair he had built in the night, and the way he stood beside her when Warren came, and the way he said her name, and the way he looked at her when she read the sonnet. A collection of very particular and irreplaceable moments that were adding up to something that she suspected was the whole of it, the real whole of it, not the outline but the fully realized thing. September came, and with it the first edge of the cold that Abel had warned her about. The high country did not ease into autumn the way the east did, with a gradual golden warmth. It shifted with a kind of authority, the evenings dropping sharply, the mornings carrying frost by mid-month. Helen found she responded to it not with the dread she might have expected, but with a bracing aliveness, the way cold air in the lungs makes you aware of the fact of breathing. She had a new opinion forming. She was almost certain she was expecting a child. She told Abel on a Sunday evening in the last week of September, sitting across from him at the table with the lamp between them and the first serious autumn wind moving against the cabin walls. She had thought about how to say it and arrived, as she usually did, at directness. "I believe," she said, "that we are going to need a larger cabin." He looked up from the accounts he was reviewing. "I have been thinking the same thing," he said. "The winter is going to feel close in here." "It is going to feel considerably closer," she said, "by spring." He looked at her, he understood. She watched him understand it, watched the expression on his face move through something complex and private and then arrive, fully and without reservation, at joy. It was not a small joy, cautiously held. It was the real thing, and it crossed his face like weather, and he came around the table and held her in a way that was careful and certain and warm. "A child," he said, into her hair. "A child," she confirmed. "I have approximately 17 new opinions forming as we speak." He made a sound that was entirely a laugh, which she had been collecting for months, each one valuable because he did not give them easily. She felt it against her. This man who had been alone too long and had built her a chair in the dark and stood steady beside her when she needed it, and read political philosophy by lamplight with genuine absorption, and loved her. She knew now, with the full and patient depth of a man who had been holding something in reserve for 3 years and had found someone worth releasing it for. The cabin building began in October, before the serious winter set in, and it was an enterprise that involved not just Abel and Helen, but, in the way of frontier communities when they function as they should, half the neighboring ranchers and their families. This was another thing Helen had not anticipated: the community labor of the frontier, the way people who lived at distances from each other came together for major work with a practical solidarity that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with mutual survival. Sheriff Braddock came. Several ranchers Helen had met through Mrs. Page came. 2 men Abel had known for years, Jim Reeves and his son Thomas, came with a wagon load of lumber. Mrs. Page herself came in her good working dress, and she organized the feeding of the workers with the same military efficiency she brought to Raydrock society, and she told Helen plainly that she had known the first week that this would work out, which was not what Helen remembered of that first week, but she accepted it in the spirit it was offered. The new cabin was not a mansion. It was not elaborate. But it was twice the size of the first one, with a real parlor, which Helen noted with satisfaction and which Abel acknowledged, in the small interior way he acknowledged most things, with a look that said he remembered the original complaint and was glad to be correcting it. There was a proper bedroom. There were windows fitted with actual glass, brought up from Denver at considerable expense, which let in the canyon light without the canyon wind, and the effect of this was, on the first morning in the new cabin, so beautiful that Helen stood at the eastern window for several minutes just watching the light come through. The parlor had a bookshelf built into the wall properly, with brackets and boards and enough space for more than 4 books. She arranged her books on it, and then there was space remaining, and Abel filled it with the geology texts and the history of Rome and a botanical encyclopedia he had sent away for and which had arrived, he explained, only the week before, because he had sent for it in August. She had not known about the botanical encyclopedia. She stood looking at it on the shelf next to her own botanical field guide, these 2 books sitting side by side as naturally as though they had always been meant to share a shelf, and she pressed her lips together against something that was not entirely composed. "You ordered that in August," she said. "I thought you would run out of things to name," he said. She turned and looked at him, and he was standing in the parlor doorway with that almost smile, and she crossed the room and put her arms around him, and he held her there in the new parlor of their new cabin with the canyon light coming through the glass windows. And outside the October land was going gold and crisp, and the cattle were moving in the south pasture, and the kitchen garden, finished for the season, had already produced more than she had hoped, and everything was. In the fullest and most real sense of the word, good. The winter came the way Abel had described, with authority and without apology. The first snow came in November, and the serious cold came in December, and the canyon in winter was a different creature from the canyon in any other season, dramatic and white and sealed, the walls rising from the snow like the bones of something enormous. Helen found the winter beautiful in the way she had found the cold air beautiful, with a bracing awareness, a sense of the real and elemental. She could not do the outside work in the heaviest weather, and Abel was careful about her without being managing, which she appreciated. She spent the long winter days writing in her journal, which was now nearly full, and reading, and sewing things the baby would need, which was a practical occupation and also, she discovered, a deeply satisfying one. She was not a woman who had spent much time on domestic craft, but there was something about making a small garment for a specific small person who was not yet here but was already real that reached a place in her she had not known existed. Abel read in the evenings. He had worked through Mill and was working through a collection of essays she had written to a Denver bookshop for, because the parlor bookshelf required filling, and she could not in good conscience let a good shelf go empty. He read with the same careful absorption he brought to everything, and sometimes he read aloud, which was a development she had not anticipated. He had a reading voice that was unhurried and deep, and she found herself setting down her own work to listen, and he knew it and did not comment, but once or twice she caught the small interior satisfaction in his expression that meant he was pleased. They talked through the long evenings about everything. About the baby, what kind of person the baby might be, what the ranch would look like in 10 years, what was happening in the wider country, the politics that filtered through the newspapers that arrived weeks after the events they described, the changes that were coming to the territory. They talked about education, and whether there might be a school in Raydrock that needed someone with Helen's qualifications, which was an idea Abel supported with a directness that made her look at him sharply. "You want me to teach?" She said. "You are a teacher," he said. "It's what you are. A ranch doesn't change that." She looked at him for a long moment. "Most men in your position would prefer their wives at home." "I am not most men in my position," he said, "and you are not someone who should be at home if there is something worth doing outside it." She had 12 opinions. 3 of them in that moment were simply the word Abel, which was not technically an opinion but was the most complete thing she could form. "I will look into it in the spring," she said. "Good," he said, and went back to his book, and she went back to the small garment in her hands, and the winter cabin held them in its warm interior while the canyon held its white silence outside. The baby was born in March of 1879, in the new bedroom of the new cabin, with Mrs. Page and a woman named Ellen Carr, who served as the nearest thing Raydrock had to a midwife in attendance, and Abel in the main room at Helen's insistence, because she was going to manage the birth in the way she thought best, and she thought best not to have him in there being stoic about things. She heard him in the main room during the long hours. She heard him at the table, not moving much, very still in the way he was still when he was containing something. She did not call for him until it was done, and when it was done and she was holding the boy, and yes, it was a boy, small and loud and red-faced, and already she was certain forming opinions, she said to Mrs. Page, "Please let him in." Abel came into the room. He looked at her first, with an intensity of relief and love that was entirely unguarded, the most open she had ever seen his face, and then he looked at the baby, and what happened to his expression then was something she kept for the rest of her life in the same collection as the chair built in the night, and the sonnets and the botanical encyclopedia on the shelf. He sat on the edge of the bed and took the boy with a careful reverence that was completely at odds with the size of his hands, and he held him and looked at him, and Helen watched his face. "He looks like he is already arguing about something," Abel said. "He is mine," Helen said. "It would be strange if he wasn't." Abel looked up at her and smiled, not the almost smile, not the interior satisfaction, A real, full smile, and it changed his whole face, and she thought that it had taken her until this moment to see it completely and that she would spend the rest of her life being glad she had. They named him James Henry Dunlap. James for Abel's brother, who had been lost too young. Henry for Helen's father, who had called her opinions a gift. James Henry was, from the first week, a person of considerable personality. He ate with conviction, slept with stubbornness, and regarded everything in his field of vision with a focused intensity that Abel said he must have gotten from his mother and Helen said he must have gotten from both of them, which was the truth and also more interesting. Spring came again, and with the spring the canyon woke back up into color, and the cattle moved in the pastures, and the kitchen garden was planted again, larger this time, and Helen walked James Henry in the mornings along the canyon path in the second-hand perambulator she had arranged to have sent from Denver, which was an object of considerable novelty in the vicinity of Red Rock. She went to see the school situation in April, with James Henry on her hip, and found that there was indeed a need. The one-room schoolhouse had been operating with a rotating series of inadequate arrangements since the previous teacher left the year before, and the 8 children currently enrolled were receiving an education that Helen assessed in approximately 3 minutes as insufficient. She made her assessment known to the school board, which was a committee of 3 ranchers and a shopkeeper, with the directness they were perhaps not accustomed to, but which she delivered with enough practical specificity that they agreed, by the end of the meeting, that she would take the position 3 mornings a week with compensation. Abel had arranged with Ellen Carr to look in on James Henry during those mornings. When Helen told him the terms, he nodded. 3 mornings is a start, he said. It is, she agreed. I may have opinions about expanding it. I expect you will, he said, she taught. She returned to it the way you return to something that is genuinely part of your nature, with a relief and a rightness that confirmed the instinct. The children of Red Rock were different from her Philadelphia students in practical details and alike in every essential way. Curious, resistant in turns, capable of more than they were given credit for, desperately in need of someone who took their minds seriously. She took their minds seriously. Within a month, 2 more children had been enrolled by parents who had heard, through the efficient network of Frontier Community, that the new schoolteacher was worth attending. Life in Red Rock had a texture now that Helen could not have imagined before she came. It was nothing like the life she had left, and it was not what she had imagined when she answered the advertisement, because she had not had the right information to imagine it correctly. It was harder and stranger and more physically demanding than she had known to plan for. It was also larger than she had understood a life could be. Larger in the immediate physical sense, the sky and the canyon and the scale of the country, and larger in the inner sense, the feeling of being in a place that had not yet decided what it was and where, consequently, neither had you. She had room here to be everything she was. The opinions did not require suppressing. The books did not require apologizing for. The intelligence was not a liability. The fierceness was not a social problem to be managed. She was Helen Hurst Dunlap, teacher and rancher's wife and mother and gardener and reader and opinionated and alive, and the frontier had room for all of it, just as Abel had said. On the day she arrived and looked at the curtain that hadn't been hung yet, and he looked at her trunk and she looked at him, and neither of them knew yet what they were to each other. The second year settled into its rhythms. James Henry grew with the land-specific pace of a child who is primarily outdoors, pulling himself to standing along the fence posts by late summer, walking with determined instability by the autumn, and forming what Helen was fairly certain were actual opinions by his first Christmas, when he made very clear through expression and insistence that he preferred Abel's hat to the small cap she had knitted for him, and wore the hat at a sideways angle for the entire afternoon, while Abel watched with helpless delight, and Helen wrote the incident in her journal, because it seemed important to record. By the second spring, Helen had expanded the school to 4 mornings a week and 12 students, and was conducting a quiet campaign with the Territorial Education Office in Denver for materials, which she carried on entirely by letter, and with the systematic persistence of a woman who has 12 opinions and will express each of them until they produce results. Abel watched this campaign with undisguised admiration. He had always been clear-eyed about her capacities, but there was something about watching her work, the focused, articulate, comprehensive way she went about achieving things she had decided were worth achieving, that continued to move him in ways he expressed, when he expressed them, with characteristic economy. "You will get it," he told her one evening when she read him a particularly frustrating response from the Denver office. "I know," she said. "I am deciding how long to allow them to be wrong before I write again." "About a week," he said. "About 5 days," she said. She wrote in 5 days. The materials arrived 6 weeks later. Mrs. Page had become, in the particular way of the frontier, something between an ally and a friend. It was never a warm friendship in the conventional sense. They were too different in temperament for warmth to be the primary element. But it was a real friendship, founded on mutual respect and a shared practical intelligence, and the simple fact that they were both women of considerable character in a place that had room for it, and that they had recognized this in each other past the initial friction. Mrs. Page brought peach preserves. Helen brought opinions. They were both useful. In the late summer of 1880, Helen discovered she was expecting again. She told Abel in the same way she had told him the first time, with directness, sitting across from him at the table that now had a third chair pulled up to it for James Henry, who at this stage of his development was primarily interested in the table as a surface to bang things on rather than a location for family conversation. But the principle was established. "The cabin is going to need to be even larger," she said. Abel looked up from what he was working on, and she watched him understand, and watched the joy come into his face again, no less for being the second time. "I will start drawing plans," he said. "We do not need to be excessive," she said. "We have a son who grows at the rate of weather," he said, "and a second on the way. I think we can afford to be somewhat excessive." She looked at him with deep affection. "You have been living with me for 2 years," she said. "I have. And you are still using the word excessive about a building project." "I am beginning to think," he said, with the dry interior quality that was one of her favorite things about him, "that I may have more opinions than I originally disclosed." She laughed, and James Henry, startled by the sound and delighted by it in the way he was delighted by anything that involved his mother's full attention, banged the table with both hands as an accompaniment, and the late summer evening in the canyon held all of it. The laughter and the plans and the small emphatic hands, and the two people across the table who had found each other across 12 letters and 2,000 miles and 1 trunk and 12 opinions, and had built something real and particular, and entirely their own. The second addition to the cabin went up that autumn with the help of Jim Reeves and Thomas and 2 younger men who were relatively new to the area, and it gave them a second bedroom and a larger kitchen, and Abel built new bookshelves in the parlor against the wall, floor to ceiling, with a symmetry and craftsmanship that was considerably beyond functional, that was, in fact, beautiful, and when Helen saw them finished, she stopped in the doorway and looked at him. "When did you learn to do that?" she said. "I have been practicing on smaller things," he said. "Since last winter." She looked at the shelves. She looked at him. "You built these because you knew I would need them." "I built them because you will always need more shelves," he said. "That is not an accusation. It is simply true." She went and ran her hand along the smooth wood, the careful joinery, the brackets perfectly spaced, and she thought about what it meant to be known that way, to be understood so precisely that a person builds you bookshelves in advance of your needing them because they can see clearly who you are and what you require, and they find it not a burden but a rightness. And she thought it was the most romantic thing she had ever encountered, more than any sonnet, though she would not stop reading the sonnets. "Abel," she said. "Yes." "I love you." She had said it before. She said it in the way she said things, directly and without ornamentation. But something in this particular moment, In this room with its new shelves and its empty spaces waiting for books, and the autumn light coming through the glass windows, and the sound of James Henry in the kitchen taking a great interest in something he was not supposed to take an interest in, made it feel like the first time and the truest time and the time she would remember. He crossed the room and put his hands on her face and said, "I have loved you since the 5th letter." "The 5th," she said. "You were correct about the Roman Republic," he said. "I had not thought about it the way you described it." "I should have, but I had not. I knew then." She loved him beyond her ability to express with 12 opinions or 1,200, and she kissed him there in the new room with the autumn light, and the sound of their son being comprehensively mischievous in the other room, and it was the best thing she had experienced. And she said so, and he laughed again, the full laugh that she had collected so carefully since the first days, and that was still precious and always would be. Their daughter was born in February of 1881, in the middle of a snowstorm that kept the canyon white and still for 3 days, and she arrived with considerably less drama than James Henry had required, and looked at everything around her with enormous dark eyes that were thoughtful in a way that Helen found immediately recognizable, and Abel said could only mean trouble of the interesting kind. They named her Clara Frances Dunlap. Clara for Abel's first wife, because Helen had suggested it and meant it without complexity, because Clara had loved this man and shaped this life, and deserved to be remembered with love rather than with the silence of avoidance. Frances for Helen's grandmother, who had been the first person to tell Helen that her opinions were not too many but only too lively for small rooms. James Henry, who was 2 years old, regarded his sister with the philosophical detachment of a person who has decided to withhold judgment until the situation becomes clearer, and then, within a week, was entirely captivated by her. He sat beside her cradle with an attention that was, Helen noted in her journal, the most purely concentrated she had seen him bring to anything, and when she was old enough to hold his finger in her fist, he looked up at his parents with an expression of profound satisfaction that was the most Abel-like expression Helen had ever seen on him. The school had grown to 14 regular students by the spring of 1881, and Helen had 2 mornings a week freed by the fact that Ellen Carr's daughter, who was 17 and clever, helped with the younger ones. She had achieved the materials from Denver and was conducting a new campaign for a second, slightly enlarged schoolhouse, because the one-room building was genuinely at capacity, and she had opinions about what an education could look like if given proper space. Abel supported this campaign by appearing at a town meeting in April and making a concise and entirely persuasive argument for the investment, which he delivered with the plain, clear authority of a man who does not speak often in public and therefore commands attention when he does. The town agreed. The building fund was established. It was a small triumph and a real one, and that evening at the table with James Henry eating with systematic enthusiasm and Clara Frances regarding her supper with the thoughtful eyes she brought to everything, Helen reached across and covered Abel's hand with hers. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You were right about it," he said. "Saying you are right about it is different from doing something about it. I thought doing something about it was worth doing." She squeezed his hand. He turned it over and held hers. James Henry, having observed this exchange with the alert sociological curiosity of a 2-year-old, immediately reached across and put his hand on top of theirs with a conviction that suggested he had been meaning to do exactly this, and was very satisfied to have found the right moment. Abel laughed. Clara Frances made a small sound of agreement or possibly complaint. Helen looked at her family around this table, in this cabin that had grown from one room to several, with the shelves full of books and the garden growing outside and the canyon holding everything in its ancient, indifferent, somehow also tender embrace, and she was so full of something that she could not have named it with any number of opinions. She wrote in her journal that evening, after the children were asleep and Abel was reading by the lamp, and the fire was down to coals, and the night outside the glass windows was clear and starred and enormous. She wrote everything she had been unable to say at the table with the full hands, and she wrote it carefully and at length, because she believed in precision, and she believed in record, and she believed that some things deserve to be written down so they do not get lost. She wrote, "I came here with one trunk and 12 opinions and a rational assessment and a set of convictions. I did not come here looking for this. I did not know this was a thing that could be found. But this is the country where things can be found that you did not know you were looking for, if you are willing to look at them honestly when they present themselves. He built me a chair in the dark on my first night here. He stood beside me when my past came knocking. He built me bookshelves because he could see who I was and what I would need. He read Mill by lamplight and asked real questions and laughed at my real jokes and said I love you in a way that had no performance in it. I came to the frontier with one trunk and 12 opinions, and he said the cabin had room for all of it, and he has been right every single day since. The years that followed were the years of the thing being built, the family, the ranch, the school, the life that in its fullest expression was more than the sum of any individual component. The second schoolhouse was built in the fall of 1882 and dedicated with a small ceremony at which Helen spoke and meant every word. The cattle herd grew under Abel's careful management to a size that made the ranch genuinely profitable rather than merely viable. James Henry, who was 3 and then 4 and then 5, developed into a person of such comprehensive opinions and robust outdoor energy that Helen privately thought he was a fair composite of both his parents, and intended to be considerably more trouble than either of them had been separately. Clara Frances was a different creature, quieter, with the deep observational quality that Abel had in his bones, watching everything with those dark eyes and processing it somewhere interior before producing, at intervals, remarkably precise observations that startled people who had not been paying attention to her. She would sit with Abel in the evenings when he read and look at the pages with the focused attention of someone about to do something about literacy, and when Helen began teaching her letters at 4, she came to them with a seriousness that was immediately recognizable as her own. "She reads the way you read," Abel said one evening, watching Clara Frances with a primer at the kitchen table. "She reads the way she reads," Helen said, "which happens to involve full sentences before her 5th birthday and opinions about the quality of the text." "She told me the primer was condescending," Abel said. "She is right," Helen said. "I have always thought so." Sheriff Braddock retired in 1883. And the new sheriff was a younger man named Garfield who had grown up in the territory, and who regarded Helen with the respectful wariness that Raydrock's law enforcement had come to accord the schoolteacher whose opinion on educational funding had been known to appear in the Denver newspapers. She had not planned the Denver newspapers. She had simply written a very precise letter to the editor about a specific funding matter, and the editor, with whom she had subsequently corresponded, had published it and invited her to write again. Abel had read the first published letter with the expression he wore for things he was privately very proud of and was not going to make a large production of. "You did not tell me about this letter," he said. "I was not certain it would be published." "You were certain it would be published," she considered. "I had an opinion about its likelihood." He put the newspaper down and looked at her. "Helen Dunlap," he said, "you are the most complete and extraordinary person I have ever known." She felt this land in her chest with the particular weight of things that are true and said at the right moment. "I have 12 opinions about that statement," she said. "Tell me one," he said. She looked at him across the table, this man who had put an advertisement in a newspaper in a moment of honest courage disguised as practical necessity, who had written 12 letters with increasing authenticity, who had built her a chair and hung a curtain and stood in a yard and read a sonnet and held his daughter and raised his son and built shelves and read books and laughed when it was real and been still when that was what was needed. "I believe you," she said. He smiled. "Full. The one that changed everything." Outside, the Colorado evening came across the canyon in colors that had no name in the eastern palette: deep amber and violet, and the particular blue of high altitude approaching dark. And the land held its ancient peace around the cabin that had grown room by room to hold two people, and their children and their books and their opinions and their history and their ongoing, unfinished, magnificent daily life. By 1884, the school had 16 students enrolled, and Helen was in correspondence with two other women in the territory who were conducting similar enterprises in their own communities. A correspondence that had produced plans for a teachers' association, which she was organizing with the same systematic energy she brought to all things worth doing. Abel had taken James Henry, now 6, out with him in the mornings to do the simple tasks of the ranch that a careful and attentive boy could do, and James Henry performed them with the seriousness of someone who considers himself fully employed and with enough enthusiasm to require supervision. Clara Frances had at 5 years old a reading ability that exceeded most of the children in the school by 2 grade levels, which Helen recorded without surprise and without excessive pride, but with the satisfaction of someone who recognizes a mind for what it is. She had her father's stillness and her mother's precision and something that was entirely her own, which was a quality of patience with other people's confusion that was more generous than either parent had naturally, and that made her, at 5, the person James Henry came to when he didn't understand something he was embarrassed not to understand. Helen planted a second garden in the spring of 1884, an herb garden separate from the kitchen garden, because she had been consulting a medical text that had arrived from Denver, and she had opinions about what the community lacked in terms of readily available remedies, and she was doing something about it. Abel watched the herb garden go in with the expression he wore when her projects were operating at full scale. "Is this the beginning of something larger?" he asked. "Most things are," she said. He helped her stake the beds. He had come to this, over the years, to being genuinely useful in the areas that were hers rather than standing at a respectful distance from them. It was a quality she had not expected and found more valuable than she could quantify. James Henry turned 7 in the autumn of 1885 and declared at the breakfast table on the morning of his birthday that he intended to be a rancher and also possibly a person who read books about geology, because he had been looking at Abel's geological texts and had opinions about them. Abel looked at Helen over the head of their son with an expression of such complete and hopeless love for the whole situation that she nearly knocked her coffee over. Clara Frances turned 4 that winter and received her first real book as a birthday gift. Not a primer, but a proper book of illustrated natural history, and she sat with it for the remainder of the day with the thoroughness of someone conducting a formal examination of a new subject. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was the hardest Helen had experienced in her years on the frontier. The cold came earlier and deeper than usual, the kind of winter that tests the preparation of every household in the territory, and there were weeks in January when the canyon was frozen in a way that was genuinely beautiful and genuinely dangerous. Abel managed the cattle through it with the skilled calm of someone who has been through hard winters before, losing fewer animals than most of the neighboring ranchers because of his preparation. Helen kept the school running on reduced days, bringing older students to help smaller ones with lessons that could be done inside in the warmth. She learned in that winter the full depth of the community that had grown up around her here. Neighbors checking on neighbors, supplies shared. The Reeves family, who had a harder winter than most, were helped without ceremony and without the particular cruelty of pity. Mrs. Page organized it all with her usual efficiency, and it was only afterward, in the thaw of February, that Helen understood how much Mrs. Page had also kept an eye specifically on the Dunlap property during the worst weeks, sending her son by when the weather allowed, and that this was not practical community management, but was, in the idiom of Mrs. Cordelia Page, friendship. Helen brought a jar of preserved peaches to Mrs. Page in March, when the first thaw came and the canyon was wet and promising, and the birds had come back to the south-facing slopes. Mrs. Page looked at the jar. "You don't preserve peaches," she said. "I learned this winter," Helen said. "I have several opinions about the result." Mrs. Page opened the jar and tasted the preserves with the expression of a professional evaluator. "Adequate," she said, which was, in the vocabulary of Cordelia Page, very nearly a triumph. Helen walked home in the March thaw with the canyon opening its spring colors around her, the red rock warming in the first real sun, the grasses coming up in the south-facing meadows, the creek running high and cold and clear. She had been here 8 years now. She had come with 1 trunk and 12 opinions, and the frontier had taken both and not diminished either, but had added to them, year by year, the particular weight and texture of actual life, the thing that lies on the other side of rational assessment and careful calculation, the thing that happens when you choose and commit and stay. She could hear James Henry in the yard before she reached the property. He was helping Abel with the fence on the north line, the same fence she had repaired on her first week here, and she heard his voice asking Abel something with the focused inquisitiveness that was his constant mode, and she heard Abel answering with the patience and precision he brought to teaching things he cared about, and she stood for a moment at the edge of the property and listened to this, the sound of her family in the early spring sun. Then Clara Frances came around the corner of the cabin and found her standing there, and regarded her with those thoughtful dark eyes and said, "You are standing in the cold." "I was thinking," Helen said. "About what?" Helen looked at the fence where Abel and James Henry were working, at the canyon walls catching the spring light, at the cabin with its 2 additions and its glass windows and its full bookshelves visible through the parlor window from here. "About how things turn out," she said. Clara Frances considered this with appropriate gravity. Then she took her mother's hand, the small, serious hand of a 4-year-old who has been paying attention, and led her toward the cabin. "Papa made coffee," she said. "Then we should have some," Helen said. Inside, the cabin held its warmth against the March air, the smell of the fire and the coffee, and the particular smell of a lived-in home. Helen took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, and stood for a moment in the doorway of the parlor, looking at the bookshelves Abel had built, the 2 books side by side, her botanical field guide and the encyclopedia he had sent away for, surrounded now by years of accumulated volumes, the shelf full and overflowing onto the lower shelf, which was also full. He had built a 3rd shelf last November. She ran her hand along the spines of the books, these companions she had carried across 2,000 miles in a trunk on a train and a wagon, these 12 opinions she had formed in letters, and tested in reality, and found not diminished but enriched by the testing. And she thought of everything they had been through, and everything they had built, and everything that still lay ahead. The school and the children and the ranch and the community, and the ongoing extraordinary ordinary life of 2 people who had found each other by accident and by will and by the honest courage of a letter sent and a letter answered. Abel and James Henry came in from the fence, loud with the cold and the effort, and a conversation about soil composition that James Henry was pressing with considerable determination. Abel looked up when he came through the door and found her standing in the parlor doorway, and his expression did what it always did now, settled into something open and warm and fully present. "Good walk," he said. "Excellent," she said. "I have several new opinions." He came and stood beside her in the doorway, looking at the bookshelves, at the 2 books side by side in the middle of the arrangement. "We are going to need another shelf," he said. "You are very good at anticipating my requirements," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, into the warmth and the solidity of this man who had said the cabin had room for all of it and had meant it and had been building the room ever since. "I have been practicing," he said. Outside, the spring came fully into the canyon, and the land that did not care about any particular person's happiness was, nonetheless, full of light. James Henry was at the table attempting to explain to Clara Frances the geological significance of the red rock formation he could see from the kitchen window. Clara Frances was listening with the patient courtesy she extended to her brother when he was telling her things she largely already knew. Abel was at the stove. The coffee was ready. Helen took her place at the table, the chair Abel had built in the dark on her first night here, the one that had started it all, the one that was now worn smooth with years of use and still fit the table perfectly, still fit the room perfectly, still fit her life exactly right. She had 12 opinions and a 13th forming and a 14th not far behind, and the cabin had room for all of them. It always had. It always would.